Good evening viewers, welcome back to my channel Literati. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you like if you're interested in the uploads or the updates on various topics of English literature with original viewpoints and insights. Today, in a sort of a continuation of my last two uploads on T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock, I will discuss some of the important images from that poem, the iconic images which have become a part of modern poetry and English literature in the 20th century. And today I will also try to highlight a few points on the two concepts of English poetry, the two aspects rather, or the two trends which are known as symbolism and imagism. Imagism in particular is considered to be the main impulse or the chief source of construction of modern poetry. Both symbolism and imagism are a way of expressing poetic thoughts and conveying those emotions through their poetic expression. Imagism in particular is, like I said, to repeat myself, the source of modern poetry, or it is the chief impulse or the main energy or what constructs modern poetry. So essentially, imagism belongs to the 20th century. What exactly is imagism? Let us again, in brief, consider the beginning of the 20th century. The first 10 years, the first decade, known as the Edwardian period, is the time frame in which poets like A.E. Housman and Walter de la Mare are the major poets who dominate this decade. They are certainly not a part of the Imagist movement because though they are exemplars of modern poetry, of the 20th century poetry, their style does not correspond with the Imagist movement. A.E. Housman is known for his lyricism and his elegies, his sonnets, his odes. So essentially, he is writing in the poetic style which has been prevalent before. Walter de la Mare is known for his exceptional romantic imagination. And modern poetry is anything but romantic. It is totally realistic, it is pessimistic, it is subjective, and it defines a kind of sensibility which had become even more prominent after World War I and condensed and become a part of the 20th century sensibility after the end of World War II. So let us leave the first 10 years, the first decade of the 20th century, and consider it as the Edwardian period. The movement which is known as Imagism began with the second decade, and most or a lot of poetry which was written in the style of the Images belongs to the second decade, from 1912 and particularly to 1917. We must remember that the Love Song as a collection of Prufrock and other observations was also published in 1917. Ezra Pound is the first name which comes to mind when we talk about the Imagist movement in poetry. Though T.E. Hume was a poet and a writer who published in 1908, who actually is considered the father of this movement. But no doubt Ezra Pound propelled it forward, and the most striking characteristic about the Imagists is that they totally discard the narrative style of the Victorian poets. This is also a movement against romanticism and sentimental expression and emotion on poetic images like moonlight and birdsong and roses. In fact, this presence of sentiment, of romanticism, of romantic imagery is discarded by Ezra Pound completely, who calls it, quotation, a dowy mess, quotation closed. So what do the symbolists actually aim at? Ezra Pound also promoted women poets like Hilda Doolittle, and the main principles of Imagist movements are accuracy, precision, direct and a very precise expression, realism, of course, a total rejection of the traditional forms of expression, especially Victorian poetry's narrative style. Imagism means using images which are physical and which are described in a physical and a very vivid style. There is no haziness. There is a complete concrete idea which is expressed through an image. The language has to be precise, concrete, and very, very vivid. The impression has to be very physical, and it has to convey just one meaning. It should also convey a physical sensation or a physical experience through that emotion. Now, let us see what symbolism is, and we will see symbolism through very definite examples. Now, symbolism, which is not a modern movement, or the other poets or earlier poets of the Romantics, even Shakespeare, they have always used symbols to convey their meanings. So symbolism is different from Imagism. Symbolism relies on imagination, because symbolism creates mental images, emotional images, not physical images. Symbolism does not have to depict a realistic world in very physical and objective representation. Symbolism uses symbols to convey emotions, not a physical sensation. Symbolism creates a symbol which is open to interpretation. It can suggest many meanings, more than an original meaning. It can suggest hidden meanings. It is full of an imagination which is different from its original reality. So you see the stark difference. While Imagism creates a physical image, very concrete, very precise, it gives a physical sensation. It is not based on imagination, but on realism. We can take two examples here. The example of symbolism. One of the greatest odes written in English poetry, Ode to a Nightingale. In this ode, Keats has given us the symbol of a nightingale as something not visual because one cannot see it, but as something emotional, something which is a symbol of perfection, of happiness, of beauty, of loveliness. Now let us contrast this image with the image of the lines with which the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock opens. The lines are about the evening sky being spread across like a patient etherized upon a table. Now this is a very physical image. It means what it is an image of. It is not a symbol of anything different from its original meaning. It is a perfect example of Imagism, while the nightingale in Keats's immortal ode is a perfect example of symbolism. Similarly, other great odes like Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, where the west wind is not merely a wind, but it is a symbol of force, of power, of something which has the ability to transform. Let us take the example of another great sonnet of the great Shakespeare himself, sonnet number 18, where he asks his beloved the immortal question, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Here, summer's day is again a symbol of not only a day in summer, but of so many different things, so open to interpretation. It has a wealth of meaning. It can mean the transience of beauty. It can also mean the perfection of the season. It can also mean, ironically, the fact that summer has the other side because it also comes as a reminder of the passage of time. So these three examples which I've given are perfect examples of what symbolism means based on imagination, of course, a romantic feeling, emotion, interpretation, and something which can be different from its original meaning. On the other hand, Imagism, which is the inspiration or the movement of the modern times, creating modern poetry. The famous poets like Ezra Pound and of course T.S. Eliot, who was deeply influenced by the images. It creates the physical image of sickness of the modern world through an imagery of a patient etherized upon an operating table, very direct, very concrete, and very, very visible. So, these two explanations, they define completely the difference between symbolism and Imagism. But of course, in literature, there are fluidities of meanings. They are movements which run side by side, overlap. So imagery and symbols in poetry, they can often correspond, and the same poets can apply both these concepts to their poetry, but the images, like Ezra Pound, they have this clear, sharp definition about how Imagism is different from symbolism, which was based more on romantic imagination and emotion, while Imagism is something direct, concrete, and it means what it conveys. We can take examples from the modern day life as well, from general life. Let us take the color green, used as a symbol. It ceases to mean merely the color, but it also means something which is positive, something which is harmless. When we see a sign, it means that it is a positive sign, whatever context it is used. This is an example of what we would call symbolism. Let us take the example of Imagism. If we see a sign of, let us say, a skull and bones, it means what it is supposed to convey. It has just one single meaning, a physical meaning. It means danger. These two definitions of symbolism and imagism in a very pedantic setting, in a very prosaic setting, are something which can clear the concept about these two movements in poetry, which are often confusing and which often merge into each other. But the best way to understand it, that imagery or imagism in the modern poetry, it is a sharp definition in very direct, concrete language of a very direct image in a physical sense, which means what it is supposed to convey. While symbolism is based on something which is open to interpretation, it can be viewed through imagination, it can have more than one meaning, while an image signifies just that single meaning. Like I gave you the example of the opening image from the love song of J.Alfred, Prufrock. Now, these movements in literature, which gained, especially the different movements from the mid-19th century and the last decades of the 19th century, we consider the beginning of realism and the modern age, not only in literature, in drama, in fiction, but also in painting, because these are all artistic movements and they come together. There are also ideas like Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and so on. And we can see that this kind of new movements were gaining momentum from the mid-18th century. From 1859, the movements of Impressionism, and which created or which depicted objects in the natural way, in the natural light, which we can compare to depiction of real life, to post-impressionism, which was based on the painter's viewpoint, which gave way to, in the 20th century, to other movements in art like cubism, abstract painting, collage, surrealism, and all kinds of disturbed images based on totally subjective interpretation of art, as we can see in the paintings of Picasso and other great painters like Salvador Dali, or the art movement which came in the aftermath of World War I and World War II. So Imagism and symbolism and surrealism and impressionism and post-impressionism, these are terms which are used in context of art and literature, and these movements coincided because these movements in a different direction, they occurred around the same time in the visual arts like painting, and of course in literature, as we have seen, and especially in the second decade of the 20th century, which is also the beginning of World War I. And of course, as the century moved on, the human race was witness to World War II as well, which all created radical changes in the way of thinking, experiencing, feeling, and of course expressing. Today I hope that this emphasis on the difference between symbolism and imagism is clear. These changes towards modernism took place in architecture as well, because in the earlier centuries, in the 19th centuries as well, the architecture was heavy, ornate, cumbersome, huge. Now, in the 20th century, with the changes in lifestyle, with the world wars, with urbanization, with industrialization, with greater need, the rise in population and greater need for housing, the modern architecture also totally changed the concept of building and architecture, because modern architecture was no frills, no ornamentation. The idea of minimalism came in, which can be related to cubism in painting. The designs became more functional, and as spaces became more cramped with need for more housing, as the population migrated towards cities, the growth in metropolitan cities, the need for more living spaces, the skyscrapers came into existence. And because people had smaller spaces, the idea of letting in natural light and air with long windows and use of glass and terrace gardens, and to create an illusion of space. And all this was related to the changes in the modern lifestyle, especially which were accelerated after World War I and World War II. And in poetry, as we have seen, the movement of the Imagist poets completely took a break from the Victorian poetry, as it was more inclined towards narration, towards romance, towards imagination, and towards emotion. The emotion which predominated in the 20th century is, of course, as we know, one of pessimism, a totally subjective experience. As T.S. Eliot's The Love Song is also the thoughts of the protagonist in a stream of consciousness technique. That kind of psychological meandering of thoughts was also a concept which came in with the psychological novel and the stream of consciousness technique, which was also related to the post-impressionist movement, which tried to create an inner reality, not only a visual reality. And as far as history goes, on the early 20th century, we are looking at how these concepts came in. One of the famous quotations by Virginia Woolf is quotation, "On or about December 1910, human nature changed," quotation closed. Virginia Woolf, who, as we know, was one of the greatest novelists of this stream of consciousness style of the psychological novel, she mentions the time, December 1910, calling it the exact year and month where the human nature changed. That is, the human consciousness or the way of looking at things. The reason she chooses this particular time is that was the month and the year of the first exhibition in London of post-impressionist paintings, the paintings of Picasso and Cézanne, and how they have deviated or changed the expression or painting from the style of the Impressionists, which portrayed their subject matter in natural light, to one of an intensely subjective interpretation of their subject matter. Similarly, we can see how symbolism gave way to Imagism, where the image is supposed to convey the meaning and it is not based on imagination. T.S. Eliot owed a lot to Ezra Pound. He was not only close friends with Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound edited his manuscript of The Wasteland, and Ezra Pound is considered the leading name in the symbolist movement in poetry, and these were exciting times, the early decades of the 20th century, when so many radical changes were taking place in fiction, in poetry, in drama, as we remember. These were the age of the drama of ideas, the dramas of Shaw and George Bernard Shaw and Galsworthy, the realism which had come in, this movement in, like I said, architecture, in art, and of course in poetry as well. So symbolism and imagism, these are like two different ways of looking at the world, and they view it through their own eyes. As let us take the example of T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock once again, and if we look at the images which are present there, they are perfect examples of Imagism. The first image with which the poem opens, like the image of moral sickness, that of a sick person euthanized upon an operating table. The never-ending streets which move, and they are never-ending because they are directionless. One cannot see where they are going. They are compared to insidious arguments which do not take you to any conclusion. And modern life is full of confusion, and T.S. Eliot himself cannot come to a conclusion, cannot make a decision. His life is full of absurdities, just like the meandering streets which lead him nowhere. And then the refrain in the room women come and go, talking of Michelangelo, is meant to convey just that, the image of refined, sophisticated women who can talk about Michelangelo, their sophistication and their elegance. And then the famous image of the yellow fog which swirls around the streets, the narrow corners of the houses, leaps up the window, moves gracefully in the autumn evening, sort of creating a loveliness in spite of the open drains and the pollution and the soot and the black chimneys. One more very powerful image of J.Alfred Prufrock's life, his entire life, which is, as he feels, nondescript, empty, a waste, useless, is the image of his life being measured out in coffee spoons. Moment by moment, bit by bit, as the days have passed him by, he has measured out his life. He has lived all the moments without any significance, just like the coffee spoons do not leave anything behind. Similarly, his life has been without any significance, without any meaning, and without any conviction, because he is a man who is confused. His life is wasted. The music from the further corner of the room means beauty, again, which is unreachable. A very eloquent image, again an example of imagery or imagism, is when he talks about his helplessness, the fact that nobody is interested in knowing him as a person, but the world has just given him a label, and that is that he is J.Alfred Prufrock, is that of him being pinned like an insect on the wall with a label, unable to escape, wiggling. And then to define the waste of his life, he calls his days like the butt ends of cigarettes which have been smoked and forgotten and discarded into heaps of rubbish. His life is just rubbish and a waste and useless and forgotten, a statement on his non-entity. All these are examples of Imagism. They convey that physical meaning. There is animal imagery also on the description of the light brown hair, the down, the soft hair which is visible in the harsh light, covering the white arms of the braceleted lovely woman with the hands which lie so carelessly, the arms which lie so carelessly, languidly and effortlessly on the table, which looks so attractive and alluring, and at the same time there's a hint of menace, almost an animal imagery of a predatory animal. One very visual image completing the style of the images is that of the ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seats, which expresses the loneliness and the isolation of the protagonist, J.Alfred Prufrock, who compares himself again to another animal, that is of a crab, in a world of silence, because there is no communication between him and those people among whom he moves and makes small talk and smiles and gestures and pretends. The languorous evening, almost sensuous, because there is the element of being stroked with fingers. It is again a very vivid image, a kind of physical sensation as the day deepens into evening, slowly and softly. It is as if someone is stroking the day into oblivion, and this oblivion is something which the tortured modern everyman wishes for. Then the images of suffering and atonement, when the poet says, full of this agony, this spiritual agony, he says that I am no saint. And the images of martyrdom, of atonement for sins, of self-sacrifice, which have elevated the people who sanctified them, is not for him. It is not in his destiny. Though he has seen his head brought upon a platter, though he has offered himself for sacrifice. And then a very powerful image is that of the eternal footman, which is death. And a footman who is supposed to usher people out. This footman is the final reality, that is death. And T.S. Eliot makes his tortured everyman say or confess, because this entire interior monologue, this soliloquy, is like a self-confession, though it is internal, because the protagonist does not have the courage to express himself. He is too afraid of ridicule. There is a complete lack of understanding. He does not have the confidence. And the eternal footman is again a very powerful visual image of death. It can mean nothing else. And like I said, that is the difference between Imagism and Symbolism. A symbol like a nightingale can convey many meanings, while in Imagism, an image of the footman holding out the coat is just one meaning, that of death. And the image of Lazarus from Bible, the image of wisdom, because he had come back from death, is a wisdom which the modern man can never hope to possess, because he is pitiful, he is ridiculous. His life is a series of absurdities, and there is no sanctity and there is no meaning in his life. Then there is the image of the magic lantern throwing patterns on the wall, and this is the image of his private neurosis, his complexes, his insecurities, his weaknesses being highlighted. And for himself also, he is afraid to look at himself, because there are so many things which he tries to a void about himself. But it is not possible, and he admits, as I said, it's like a self-confession. It is something which he accepts to himself. It is a truth which he cannot deny, that he is he is not Prince Hamlet, neither was he meant to be. He is just a non-entity, a nobody. He is very ordinary. He was never a leader of men. He was never heroic. He was just one of those people who are barely noticed, easily forgotten, and unimportant. And so he says that again, a very powerful image of someone who is a sidekick, someone who does not have any important role to play in life, someone who swells a scene, who's just there to say a line or two, but easily ignored and not missed at all. And then at the close of this poem, the powerful image of the mermaids signifying beauty, perfection, loveliness, and also underlining the fact that they are beyond his reach. He says, they will not sing for me. And he has seen the mermaids going away far into the distance. And the last lines, which say that one drowns in one's despair, is again the last final statement of hopelessness, of helplessness, of depression, of a kind of pessimism and mourning. And again, we must remember that the single great or the most outstanding quality about modern literature is not only that it is intensely subjective, but also that it is very, very pessimistic. Thank you. I hope that the difference between symbolism and imagism has been very clear to you after listening to me. And like I said, in literature, two movements can coexist side by side, and they can be expressed simultaneously, though there is a stark difference between imagism and symbolism, as the examples which I have shown or which I have mentioned. The single greatest example of symbolism being the nightingale from Keats's Great Ode, or the west wind from Shelley's Great Ode, or the symbol of this summer's day and Shakespeare's sonnet number 18, and the emphasis on emotion and imagination and romance, while the stark image of a patient etherized upon an operating table in the style of the modern images, the lines with which, or the image with which the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock opens, is one of the greatest examples of the Imagist movement in poetry, conveying a physical meaning, conveying a direct and a very concrete image in a way where there is no other meaning than the physical meaning which it conveys. Thank you.